Welcome, everyone. Let's continue our journey through time exploring the final part of the Chronorama exhibition, featuring photographs from the 1960s to 1970s. If you're already at Palazzo Grassi, please proceed to the second floor. If you haven't arrived yet or are still planning your visit, let my voice in your own imagination be a guide. We're now standing in front of a photograph from 1966 by Irving Penn, one of the most important photographers in the history of Vogue, who we discussed in the previous episode. The figures shown in the photo are a woman and a child, Susan Sontag and her son, David Sontag Reef. It's amazing to see an actual portrait of the critic and philosopher Susan Sontag, as she is the author of On Photography, an essay from 1973 that still today is one of the most insightful analyses ever written on the nature of photography. David Sontag Reef was born in 1952 from a relationship between Susan Sontag and the sociologist Philip Reef when Sontag was only 17 years old. They got married a few days after they met, but the couple separated in 1958, and Susan had several relationships afterwards, including a long love affair with the famous photographer Annie Leibovitz. In 1966, David Sontag Reef was 14 years old. There's something magical about Penn's portrait of mother and son. Sontag writes in On Photography that photographers actively tend to incite a sense of nostalgia. Yet in the case of this portrait, we don't perceive anything wistful at all. The two, framed in close-up, open themselves to the lens with a special clarity and transparency. They seem to be looking at us not from the past, but in the present. They seem to shine like a beautiful pair of apples on a tray. Susan is a young, attractive, and clearly intelligent mother. David, with his herringbone jacket, beret, and long bangs, has all the air of a bright and genial rebel. The mother protects him with a hug, and the still childish part of David seems to welcome the gesture. But we already feel the seed of adolescence pressing in him, and therefore a longing for freedom. This is one of those photos in which we can see not only the profound nature of a relationship, but a particular phase of that relationship. If there's a period of the 20th century in which the machine of myth and glamour was most alive, that was the 1960s. The editor-in-chief of Vogue America was Diana Vreeland, already an image consultant for the First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy. With Vreeland, the magazine finally opened up to a greater representation of African Americans. Figures such as writer James Baldwin, tennis player Arthur Ashe, and singers Roberta Flack and Dionne Warwick made their way to Vogue's pantheon. Among the more than 400 photographs, we also find an image of the Beatles from 1963, and of course, a portrait of their rival, Mick Jagger, voice of the Rolling Stones. Federico Fellini undoubtedly recounted the worldliness and languor of those years. Irving Penn dedicated a magnificent photograph to him and his wife Giulietta Masina. Let's take a closer look. The shot was published in Vogue in 1965, 5 years after the release of the film La Dolce Vita, directed by Fellini and winner of the Palme d'Or at Cannes in 1960.
Ma ecco il momento più atteso. La Palma d'Oro va a Federico Fellini per la sua ormai celeberrima La Dolce Vita. La decisione ha sorpreso parecchi critici e spettatori. Il film infatti aveva suscitato in Francia violente polemiche. Alcuni lo avevano definito un film fallito, altri lo avevano esaltato come un capolavoro.
The portrait of Fellini and Masina captivates the viewer thanks to the play of symmetries in the image. Let's try to describe it. Fellini's face occupies the lower half of the photo, while Masina, who is in the upper half, embraces her husband from above, with her arms wrapped around his chest and her fingers interlaced over his shoulder. Even Fellini's hands are joined and interlaced like those of someone praying, but it's Giulietta who looks upward, beyond the frame of the photograph, as if in contemplation or in search of a metaphysical inspiration. Fellini's gaze, on the other hand, is more solid, concrete, and down to earth. He looks unabashedly into the lens. It's a gaze that's so firm and determined that it almost belies Fellini's reputation as a wistful daydreamer. The eyes that look at us are those of a detective trying to ascertain whether the suspect is guilty or not. Or perhaps Fellini is just trying to hypnotize us. Meanwhile, Giulietta looks elsewhere.
Io mi auguro che anche questo ultimo film, Le notti di Cabiria, che daranno domani sera in un cinema qui, all'Imperio, abbia lo stesso successo e abbia la stessa accoglienza che ha già avuto La strada. E ancora un affettuosissimo abbraccio al pubblico di Lisbona, al pubblico portoghese in generale e in modo particolare agli ammiratori di Gelsomina e di Fellini.
Fellini's La Dolce Vita evokes many themes, such as the relationship between beauty and decadence, an idea that is also at the center of Death in Venice, the novel by Thomas Mann, translated to film in 1970 by Luchino Visconti. Gustav von Aschenbach, protagonist of the novel and the film, is a composer staying in a hotel suite on the Venetian seashore who falls platonically in love with a 14-year-old Polish boy named Tadzio. In Tadzio, he sees a classical and absolute ideal of beauty. Luchino Visconti's casting for the role was famously long and difficult. Then suddenly, he saw a certain Björn Andrésen, a 15-year-old of Swedish origin with a complicated family history. Andrésen had never known his father, and his mother had taken her own life when Björn was only 11 years old. The Chronorama exhibition displays a photo of Björn Andrésen taken in 1970 on Visconti's set in Venice. Let's look at it closer. He is a blonde Nordic boy with such delicate facial features that they almost seem penciled on. His hair is wet and disheveled from swimming in the lagoon, and his smile is on the cusp between shyness and defiantness. It is said that many years later, he would inspire the Japanese illustrator Ryoko Ikeda for his famous work, The Rose of Versailles, about a woman who since childhood dresses and behaves like a man with the features of Andrésen. Björn Andrésen's beauty would be a curse throughout his life. 50 years later, Andrésen recalls in a documentary titled The Most Beautiful Boy in the World that taking part in the Cannes Festival for the presentation of Visconti's film was a nightmare. At a delicate moment in his growth, Björn had become the object of morbid desires. There were those who gave him gifts and those who wrote poems in his honor. As shocking as it may seem, his beauty and grace as seen in the photo were not a privilege for Björn, but the cause of a series of personal difficulties and vulnerabilities, which combined with a cruel childhood led him to alcoholism and depression. The photograph was taken by English photographer David Bailey, the same author of the portrait of Mick Jagger mentioned before. David Bailey is known as the photographer to the Swinging London, a season of London's cultural life that took place between the mid and late 60s. The Swinging London was found on optimism, lightness, hedonism, enthusiasm. As the term itself suggests, swinging refers to an idea of joyous unpredictability and perpetual movement. The figure of Thomas, the photographer who drives a white Rolls-Royce in Michelangelo Antonioni's film Blow Up, is inspired by David Bailey. There are more than one of Bailey's photos on display. Through his work, we can retrace the happy images of a unique decade, one of worldliness, freedom, charm and celebrity, until we stumble upon a story that casts light on the doubts and paradoxes of the star system. In contrast to the subtle and evanescent physicality of Björn Andrésen, there is the full body shot of a 28-year-old bodybuilder, the future Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger. The shot is taken by photographer and documentarian George Butler and was published in 1975. Schwarzenegger poses in briefs on top of a roof. Two other buildings can be seen on the horizon. Schwarzenegger's muscles interact with the austere and rational lines of the architecture and with the rest of the city that we imagine beyond the edges of the photo. We are faced with a new aesthetic canon and a new form of beauty, statuesque and excessive, which the 1980s would popularize further. Here comes a culture and an obsession with the body that is still alive today. Butler's photo is from 1975, but it casts us into the present. Fashion and beauty in the 1970s were more erotic and often provocative. The famous Berlin photographer Helmut Newton was among the most significant interpreters of this new ideal. At the time, Newton was already over 50 years old and had recently experienced a heart attack while in New York. Yet his photos from the 1970s seem the result of a strong desire to unflinchingly experiment with an open mind. In a photo taken in Saint-Tropez in 1975, the protagonist is Lisa Taylor, a model who was very present on the pages of Vogue. Taylor is sitting on a sofa, and in front of her is a man wearing a pair of elegant pants and a bare torso. The photograph focuses on her gaze as she looks at the man. The strength of the shot is all in the model's blue eyes, animated by a predatory desire and determination, representing a reversal of traditional gender roles, which may seem banal today, but was modern and groundbreaking in the 1970s. Let's take a look at one last photo. It is a photo that deserves attention, also because it is different from almost all the photos on display. The photo from 1972 is by Irving Penn. This time, the protagonists are not human beings. We are looking at two cigarette butts, worn and swollen. The two butts have been placed on a surface and photographed from above, in close-up. It's a kind of still life. The two butts now form a landscape made of bumps, craters, and shades of grey. Penn invites the observer to close in, free of judgment, at the lowest form of trash, waste, refuse. He urges us to empathize with that litter which we step on or pass over. He invites us to open our eyes to a filthy habit that we would choose to ignore. He is asking us, in short, to truly use photography, to take advantage of it, to understand its most radical lesson, namely, to exercise our gaze and to be fully human.